Well, last week, Robert challenged us to think about the Beatitudes as a description of the life of faith. He reminded us that to follow Jesus means being changed from the inside out. We're going to be thinking a little bit more about that theme of discipleship today, but we're going to do so from a slightly different angle. Because chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel marks a bit of a turning point in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus moves here from talking about the what of discipleship, of describing what discipleship looks like, to the how. How do we practice discipleship? Or, as Jesus puts it here, how do we practice righteousness? Did you notice how these verses have quite a pragmatic focus? As Jesus talks about how his disciples are to give to the needy, how they are to pray, and how they are to fast. You see, these three practices of almsgiving, prayer, and fasting were fundamental to discipleship. They were fundamental to the Jewish understanding of piety. That's why, I don't know if you noticed in our reading, Jesus doesn't actually command his disciples to do these things. He doesn't need to, you see. He can safely assume that they're already doing them. That's why we read Jesus say, when you give to the needy, when you pray, when you fast. I wonder if Jesus could make that same assumption about his disciples today. Yes, giving to the needy and prayer are of course still important elements of our discipleship. But what about fasting? Maybe that's something you could think about in your discipleship groups in the next time you meet. What value does fasting have to the life of faith? What place does it have in today's church? Maybe that's a question we should especially be thinking about as we begin this season of Lent. But of course, the early disciples would have nothing to discuss if they were having a discipleship group about this. As observant Jews, these three elements, including fasting, came as naturally to them as breathing. The problem Jesus wants to address is not whether they do it, but how they do it. You see, throughout this section, Jesus is at pains to stress that there is a right way and there is a wrong way to practice righteousness, to perform piety. There's a way that might make us feel pleased with ourselves, but ultimately it is not pleasing to God. We're going to think about all of this shortly, but to fully appreciate what Jesus has to say about piety and the performance of piety in these verses, it's necessary for us to appreciate something of the historical context here. And so I want to invite you for a minute to join me on a field trip. That's one of the advantages of preaching online, isn't it? I know we're all a little bit frustrated with screens at the moment, but one of the advantages that it does have is that the internet allows us to travel almost anywhere in the world. So just for a moment this morning, I want to take you here. Okay, it doesn't look like much. Some old ruins, a few piles of rubble. But if we were to rewind the clock a couple of thousand years, we would find on this site an important cultural and political centre. A town by the name of Sepphoris, better known at the time as the Jewel of the Galilee. This was the home of Herod Antipas, largely built by him in the fashionable Greco-Roman style of the day. And if Sepphoris was the Jewel of the Galilee, then the Jewel of Sepphoris was its theatre. It doesn't look like much here, does it? But this digital reconstruction perhaps gives you some idea of what this theatre would have looked like. Mosaic floors, marble colonnades, seating for 3,000 people. This highly ornate theatre was built only 4 miles from Nazareth. Just an hour's walk, in fact, from the streets where the young Jesus would have played as a child. Of course, we have no reason whatsoever to think that Jesus attended a performance or watched a show at this theatre. In fact, it's very likely that he didn't. As an observant Jew, that's not something he would have done. But Jesus was a carpenter by trade. And as Sepphoris was the centre of trade in the region, only 4 miles from his home, it is likely that he knew about the town. And he probably knew about its theatre too. But what's all this got to do with the Sermon on the Mount? Well, in the verses we've read together, there are more than a few theatrical metaphors employed by Jesus. We know that Jesus was fond of wordplay, don't we? His teaching is marked by hyperbole, even humour at times. And in these verses, we find that Jesus exposes the false piety of his day, that outward show of religion, by poking fun at the theatre. Look at the opening verse and maybe you'll see what I mean. Be careful, warns Jesus, not to practice your righteousness in front of others or be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Now the phrase here, to be seen by them, should be translated literally as to be watched by them. It comes from the Greek word, and I hope my Greek teacher at college isn't listening to this, the theathanai, I think it is, from which, well, you've guessed it, we get our word theatre. You see, Jesus is saying here, don't practice your righteousness for the applause of others. Such efforts are pointless. There's only one audience member who matters after all, and that is God, who is unseen. You know, at college they encourage us to be able to summarise our sermons in one succinct sentence. Verse 1, I think, is Jesus' sentence summary of his sermon. On this sermon on how we are to perform piety, to practice righteousness. Everything else is just an elaboration of this one fundamental point. The next word is so, isn't it? So, says Jesus, because of this that I've just said, when you give, when you pray, when you fast, this is what you're to do. And it's really interesting to me that in all of this elaboration, Jesus continues to use the theatrical metaphor that's subtly employed here in verse 1. In fact, it's not at all as subtle or as nuanced as it appears here in the verses that follow. Let's look, for example, at Jesus' teaching on almsgiving. Let me read again what he says. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honoured by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now there's a lot going on here. First of all, we have the trumpets of the hypocrites. Well, maybe you already know that the word hypocrite actually means actor. It's used, the word hypocrite is used 17 times in Matthew's Gospel. It's a word that Jesus was quite fond of. A hypocrite is someone who play acts. Someone who puts on a mask or a costume to conceal their appearance. Someone who quite literally has two faces. Jesus uses the word to expose the insincerity of those who, like actors on the stage, are all about public applause, the high esteem of others. This understanding of hypocrite as actor helps us, I think, to understand the reference to trumpets here. Some commentators I encountered incorrectly, I think, assume or speculate that trumpets might have something to do with the synagogues at the time. But it's far more likely to be a reference here to the theatre. It's well documented that at the time, actors would have used trumpets to signal the beginning of a performance, to draw attention to their play. So Jesus is not suggesting here that there were some who would quite literally give out alms to the sound of fanfare around them, trumpets blasting. It's more that there were some who gave to the needy among them while tooting their own trumpet, as we would say, drawing attention to themselves. So we've got these two theatrical metaphors, but that's not all we have in this section. We still have my favourite allusion to the stage here in this passage about almsgiving. It's a phrase that's well known to us. We hear it in just everyday parlance. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And of course, we all have a sense of what Jesus means here, don't we? You know, it's about not publicising, drawing attention to your giving, about doing so in secret. But a little bit of understanding about theatre in Jesus' day might help us to appreciate even more what it is he's saying here. You see, actors in the ancient world were encouraged to use their hands to draw attention to the words of their mouths, to their performance. This line from an ancient dramatist, Quintilian, might help us understand this. He writes, "The left hand never properly performs a gesture alone, but it frequently acts in agreement with the right." Similarity to what Jesus says is pretty striking, isn't it? What Jesus means then by this phrase is, don't draw attention to yourself like those actors on the stage. Your giving should be performed in secret before your Father who is unseen. You see, what we have here is this concern that's repeated throughout these verses, whether it be on words of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, that we are not to be like the hypocrites. Look at Jesus' words in relation to prayer. Don't be like those actors on the street corners, he says. Don't pray as if you're performing on the stage. Instead, do it in secret. Go to that inner room of your house. Lock the door if you have to. You're praying to the one who is unseen. And when you fast, don't be like those hypocrites, those actors either. Those actors who disfigure their faces and make fasting into a farce. There's a really interesting theatrical allusion here too. You see, actors used to paint their faces to portray an emotion. And instead, what Jesus is saying to his disciples here, don't paint your faces. Wash your faces. Pour oil on your heads. In other words, groom yourselves. Take care in your appearance, not to show others that you're fasting, not to draw attention to it. Because again, you do it before your Father who is unseen. You see, whatever the example, Jesus is making the same basic point. Piety is not a performance. Jesus simply has no time for play acting. He's not interested in religious games. The only piety he wants to see performed is the piety that is done in secret, before our Father in heaven who is unseen. You know, Christ calls us to perform piety in our lives by living out the two greatest commandments: to love God and to love others. The problem with those hypocrites he refers to is that by trumpeting their generosity when they're giving to those in need, they're not showing love to their neighbour. And by broadcasting their prayers or by boasting about how they've kept away from the biscuit tin all throughout Lent, they're not showing love for God either. It's all about love of the self. And of course, while Jesus talks a lot about streets and synagogues and public spaces, he had no idea about social media, did he? And I wonder, what sort of a sermon would he have preached on this today? Can you imagine the sorts of wordplay, the type of wordplay he might have used, the sorts of metaphors he might have invoked? Be careful not to become like those social media influencers. It's not the number of followers you have, but the one you follow. Don't concern yourself with likes and retweets. Your Father sees what is done in secret and will reward you. There's a serious point here. We in the church in the 21st century need to think about how we are to perform piety, how we are to practice righteousness in our world, a world that is so much about performance, a world that exists very much in the digital realm. Maybe that's something you can discuss together in your discipleship groups as you think about we live out our discipleship in a complex world. Well, we're nearly at the end of our sermon, and maybe you're wondering to yourself, why hasn't he mentioned the Lord's Prayer yet? Well, that's a good question. And the answer is that the Lord's Prayer needs a sermon all of its own. In fact, it probably needs a sermon series. One commentator beautifully puts it like this: one of the great problems we have in preaching the Lord's Prayer is that it's too great. Every word is a diamond, and every facet is a sermon. So I'm not going to get into an exegesis of the Lord's Prayer in my conclusion here, but I do want to draw your attention to the fact that in the midst of all this teaching about false piety, Jesus includes the Lord's Prayer, this simple prayer that invites us to address our Father in heaven. This particular phrase, I think, is the climax of this sermon on false piety. It's the high point, I would argue, of the Sermon on the Mount, full stop. Because in these words, Jesus reminds us that our piety, our discipleship, like our prayers, begins with a recognition of who God is. Our Father in heaven. And that we can call this holy God our Father has everything to do with him and nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with the generosity of our giving, of the eloquence of our prayers, or indeed of the dedication of our fasting. It's all about God's grace. And so on this first Sunday of Lent, God invites all of us to put aside the theatrics, to stop play acting, as we seek to practice righteousness, to perform our piety for the sake of the one who matters, our Father who is unseen. And can I invite you to begin that journey now, as you say with me the words of the prayer that Jesus taught us. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.